Broken Circle presents Pull a String, a story preeminent fiction podcast created and narrated by Stephanie Dailey. Season 1, Unsettling Forecasts. Episode 5, Fragments, Part 2. Do you love stories, especially those that are dark, strange, and uncanny? Now this is your personal invitation to come along to where safety is left behind, where so much more is possible, and everything you know might just slowly, stealthily unravel. Do you see that thread dangling in front of you? Yes, that one, along the border of the life you've woven. Go on, give it a slight pull. Can you stop the incessant urge once it has taken hold? Would you even try? Now you have returned ready for some more of this thread to be exposed. We need not tarry here over long, but will instead bring you back into this simple visit amongst some ancient fragments. Yet who could have guessed your local history society could be a place that hides such wonders, such terrors? Here we are again, carving a hallowing path into realms you have never known. So, dear friends, sit back, curl up with your drink of choice, and get ready for a bit more strength to be loosened tonight, although not in the way you might have imagined. Now, Tim Zohar resumes his tale. As I stood there one more moment, readying myself for yet another renewed and more intensive assault, I sensed another music countering the oppression of this cacophony. The final set of sensations and pressures from those ancient shards, which really amounted to insistent and heavy there-ness, gave a final push. From far within the foundations of the deep that held this museum, it seemed further resonances rose upward. Flitting from the air around me, a bristling charge gathered in counterforce against the shards, the fragments. I was surrounded by allies I had not suspected who stood unseen beside me. In reality, the assault of the shards could have lasted no longer than a few anxious breaths. Another moment passed before I felt a hand gently take hold of my arm. I thought I heard quiet words spoken, but they evanesced away. In my lack of comprehension, their form and meaning escaped me. They brought that other music into its fullness. In a split second, the oppressive push of those elder shards had been broken. Mr. Lorenz held on a moment longer. "Well," he said, his tone light, "that was interesting. I have never seen it do that so eagerly. Its games are usually much more subtle for some reason. It singled you out." Mr. Lorenz peered at me a moment. The surge from inside those elder shards had been like a slow, oppressive mallet, yet the countermeasures had been like a soft, if insistent breeze flowing by, charged with more potency than 100 fragments. "I'm sure you've guessed by now that this is no ordinary museum," he said. As my senses were untangled and my mind unfettered, what I had first observed came back. With a stark clarity I have rarely had, I could perceive just what the fragments had kept hidden from me and others. They were, in fact, the true tale of its humiliation and defeat. I knew this room, and the shards of a blade ancient beyond description were infixed here, anchored in ways that so few could ever understand. Nothing in this room, in this museum, could be stolen or removed without permission. The place was sealed tight, not like a tomb, but rather, well, I got the impression of a hermetically sealed scroll with bands placed evenly upon it, and a wax seal whose icon I could not quite recognize echoed through my mind. Was it an eagle? A falcon? I am still not sure. Somehow I knew it at a deeper level as the seal of a legitimate authority. A king, perhaps. Was this place a museum, a repository, or a reliquary? If so, for what reason? Many questions went through my mind. For a moment I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, Mr. Lorenz was gone. When I completed my walkthrough of all the rooms and their exhibits, about an hour and a half later, I decided I was tired, perhaps exhausted. This was not the mere weariness of my other encounters, but the kind one experiences after an intense workout or a brisk walk through an unusual yet beautiful park. Overwhelmed by my visit, I just went back to New Martinsville, stayed in my hotel for what remained of that day. It had left me with a lot to digest, and I am still meditating on what happened there. I felt, how can I express it, reflective, contemplative, as if more had happened inside me than I could yet express. It must have the time it needed so it could suitably percolate. I had had such experiences so rarely before, only a few times. One revelation did hit home strongly, and almost immediately. I was either not finished with the panoply of offbeat curios, artifacts, and inexplicable caves, or it had not yet finished with me. I couldn't help but reflect further on this unutterably strange past that had been exposed during my tour of the museum, or repository, or whatever it was in reality. When uncovered, those missing pieces of history can be so intriguing and significant when they resolve at least some of the weird riddles that have plagued scholars throughout the ages. Even with all this, my mind was not unsettled but relaxed when I laid down and drifted away. On the following morning, I woke up early from strange and marvelous dreams, so I made my way quickly, getting breakfast on the run. In a short while, I was back in Zadok, up the hill, arriving at the museum not long after it opened. This time, for a reason I could not exactly express, I had a smile on my face. It had felt an age since I had smiled Jonah so deeply. As I went, I overheard two people, a man and a woman, talking about the recent trouble and how lucky everyone was that the Historical Society was still around. I was puzzled at this. What sort of trouble might it have been? Their further, although brief conversation, heard seemingly by chance, was also intriguing. They talked about other aspects of the museum that might also have been lost. This was the way I learned that it also had a research library. I knew if necessary I could, with my credentials, be able to gain access. A desire grew within me to learn as much as possible about this place. I somehow felt touched at a deep level by the objects here, even the troubling ones. It felt as if I had been thrown untimely into a deep mystery I may not have been ready to handle. When I paid for the ticket, I could not help but notice that the same young lady was there. I do not know if she recognized me from the previous day, but there was that same quiet, assured response, and eyes that were alive in a way mine hadn't been in a long while. I nodded at her again and moved back through in the opposite direction from yesterday. On this second visit, I sensed its fixed nature even more acutely. I could only guess that somehow there were higher-order configurations here, anchoring it based on some technique I couldn't understand, and linked up with dimensions even more enigmatic than the in-between or the manifold, perhaps even the highest of all the expanses. The pillar here also went into the spaces above, linking into the unseen vault overhead and anchoring it in an unmoving foundation below. There was also something new I sensed that finally manifested. I passed by one of the rooms where some of the odder relics were kept, and felt acutely a steady, unceasing vigilance. This place was guarded then, watched over in a way a simple establishment such as this shouldn't have been. This second visit sealed my conviction that someone, a sodality we did not yet know about, was using this place as a repository. Call this a guess if you will, a set of coincidences if you must, but there was something so unique about this museum, a distinction that made all the difference. I have only sensed this a few times in my life. Strolling slowly back into the entrance, I determined a third visit would be necessary. I did not mark the presence of my mysterious friend, but thought maybe he was busy elsewhere. When I left the museum, I went for a short walk, and going out toward my car noticed the path that led over toward what appeared the community graveyard. This was the cemetery I had glimpsed briefly, which had lain back from the road hidden behind some houses. As I walked slowly through, I examined a few stones here and there. I could not help but reflect on the transitory nature of death itself, that beyond it lay something else. Such was the mood this seemingly humble town had put me in. There was so much I had to report now, but I would be drawn back one more time. A kind of permanent reflectiveness had been reinfused into me and would not let me go. So on the final day of my time there, I was back again at the opening. It was now Thursday, and already I should have been on the road, but for some reason I could not resist going back. This final visit turned out to be even more interesting and illuminating than the previous two. I still do not understand everything, mind you, but who among us ever can? Approaching the building again, I noticed activity outside. Several men and two women were strolling around the building. They seemed deeply involved, as if rechecking their own work, perhaps for reasons of security, I thought. Before they noticed me, I had moved on, and I had no desire to interrupt. The building grew more distinct as I came up to the entrance again. I noticed the cedar clapboard along the outside, and also the brick wings extending massively from each side. Once more I was greeted by the same young lady, her raven hair falling in tight curls, her face a classic oval. She was like a figure out of a fairy tale, a legend from some obscure, forgotten lore. I do not mean that I found her attractive in some vulgar way. I mean that she was radiantly beautiful, in a way not appreciated in this over-eroticized age, with a kind of quiet, very forceful presence. I was only going to see her when I left one last time, but the memory of her has lingered. In her, O Jonah, I saw that some things I thought had passed from this world still remained. I am not trying to be sentimentally romantic, but coming from and through her was a light I have seen in very few people, and only once more recently. Anyway, as she sold me my ticket, she seemed surprised I had returned for a third day in a row. As I was turning, I noticed her eyes followed me, her eyebrows and forehead crinkled as if deeply puzzled. Perhaps people who have seen and tasted and known things beyond the mundane can often recognize each other. So began my third trip. I went through the local history path. More things began jumping out at me. A reference to a legend about a mysterious but small island that would appear in the river where none had been before. There are several actual islands upon the Ohio, but this was only seen before or after a kind of odd storm. The card did not specify much more except that people saw a tower and other smaller buildings, even a few houses. Anyone who dared venture out there was never seen again. I thought this latter part was just an additional warning added for effect. Other times, such taboos are implicitly very real. In this case, who could know? I doubt we would stake out the river unless the phenomena itself became a nuisance. Further up and in, I saw with fresh eyes their material on the figure of the traveling lad. The jacktails were something usually associated with western North Carolina and Virginia, but I had no idea that they went so far north. There were several odd variants recorded, or at least hinted at in the displays. In one, Jack traps the devil in an old dry well by marking the inside with a cross. In a second, Jack is confronted by a sailing ship in the sky and invited to join its crew. In a third, he and Molly are nearly trounced upon and trapped by Soap Sally, but barely manage a quick escape. Some future revenge is hinted at, but the brief text did not go any further. I was astonished and intrigued by all this. It did not for a moment cross my mind that the museum would engage in anything as crass as fake lore. But, of course, anything had to be checked against the source, whether oral, written, or sung. For a moment, when I turned the corner heading toward the music room again, the image of that ancient harp, although a reproduction, had been haunting me ever since I'd arrived. I caught a glimpse of something. It was, how can I express this without sounding crazier than my tales? Only a partial, brief vision of the edge of wheels within a wheel. Both rotated, then stopping and began again. This object, whatever it was, moved suspended above the ground. It went its way with a slow grace and steadiness, and I swear I saw, many eyes, each perceiving, each fully saturated by a consciousness I could not fathom. Once I reached the music room I had seen it pass into. There was nothing, of course. This reiterated the intense, almost certain knowledge that this place was guarded. I had heard Tim's description, following his words so intensely that the implications of what he had seen and heard did not register for a moment. When it did, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I know it was a cliché, but the air of the berserker felt suddenly charged, as if I had crossed another threshold. Once inside, there were two people waiting for me. One was the younger man, Mr. Lawrence, and the other a young lady. I saw that they looked alike and wondered if they might be twins. This is my younger sister, Skylar. She is an archivist here. I nodded. I see you have really taken an interest in this place. And half our collection isn't even on display. Behind me another figure came in. The man was tall and lanky, wearing a light blue cotton down shirt and blue jeans. He quickly introduced himself. I'm Rainer Klassen, owner of this local history museum. Whereas the brother and sister sounded as if they were from outside the county and state, this man was clearly a native. He was the owner, proprietor, and founder of his humble local archive and curio collection, as he called it. I complimented him on the displays and exhibits, the interior flow, and all the very interesting, unique pieces he'd procured. It was then he began telling me his unusual story. I can only summarize it here. Perhaps another occasion will allow me the opportunity to fill in some more. It turned out he had started this as a place where he could preserve his family's history, legacy, and the common and unusual pieces they had collected in the previous centuries, both in the old world and the new. It was just a prosperous man's hobby, a vanity project, really. The real change began after I'd opened it in an old house on the corner of Energy Highway and Front Street, and advertised in the local paper soliciting for anyone in the local community who was interested in donating or loaning objects, old diaries, pictures, books for the new county historical society I was building up. Several people gave me stuff outright. Some only loaned me things. Others just brought stuff wanting an estimate on what it might be worth. Let me tell you, it was like that TV show on a couple of occasions. You know Antiques Roadshow? Now, I'd rather have it all either donated or purchased, so it could be permanently in a safe place. But beggars can't be, you know. So I went through acquiring things as best I was able. But I ain't one to beg. At least I was able to learn some people about a lot they did not know. But they repaid me in kind by telling me a lot I did not know about this town's history and people. I had recordings and took notes as best I could, but there began creeping into those old stories and tales stranger fare than I could have imagined. That's how I came across stuff like that diary and them shards. Pardon me, those shards, those fragments. The diary or journal of one Douglas Needler was amusing, tragic, and just weird. It was a record of his time here, of course, but also of a claim he made. Mr. Douglas Needler, it appeared, was given to exploring the hollows and hills of his native community, and one day he said he must have taken a wrong turn, a very wrong turn. At some point, Douglas lost consciousness near the nook of 2 points that came together below a grassy hill, and found himself emerging from a cave that ended up being Sharpen's Gap. Anyway, he walked into town and couldn't find his own house. For a few days, he kept insisting that this town he'd lived in all his life was not called Zadok in Shepherd County, West Virginia, but was called instead Friendly in Tyler County. The geographies basically matched, although our hills were thrust upward somewhat higher. A local psych man who'd retired here gave the poor man a once-over, and after a couple of months decided he was perfectly sane, but just had this persistent false memory. The doctor could not explain this form, but he had this illusion. Old Douglas Needler, he ended up living with a retired couple on their farm for a few years. Then one day, he said he'd take a chance at Sharpen's Gap. He was never seen again. No search turned anything up. He chuckled at the ending of his tale. Maybe he did cross back over into Friendly, Tyler County, West Virginia. Who knows? I keep seeing ever stranger affairs in this world as time passes. But sorry, I always get caught up in telling that story. Rainer winked at me, a grin on his face, his laugh line showing, since it's one of my favorites. And I did meet the man once. After this, he took a closer look at me. Now, the local phase was bad enough. I'd bought, accepted, borrowed everything I could, and it was a lot. Besides, the prospect of a flood from off the river kept recurring to me. I wondered now, was I being prompted by the good Lord for a reason? I don't know, but I decided I needed to move everything up to a safer elevation. I considered the county seat, but thought it far too distant. Besides, this would require a huge investment, and my bank account isn't unlimited. So I decided I'd put up a website and see if this might not attract attention and be a way of promoting the town. This did garner some interest, but the really weird thing was that more began arriving. The return addresses would be barely traceable P.O. boxes, or were just hand-delivered, or shipped from some faraway but unknown point of origin. That's how the Jenny Hanover arrived, and the two sword and spear on either side of those shards. The fragment had themselves been found at a different point, Buried in a cave some old-timer had tried excavating out of the hill some years before. It wasn't really a cave, but a structure he'd built or thought he had into the side of a hill along one of the creeks. He died and just left it there, but the rest is a bit of a sad story. Anyway, later on, a young boy found them after he claimed they'd called to him in dreams and in stilted voices. I don't know what their origin really is, but they are a bit on the disturbing side. Something left of a larger object, a weapon, a sword, who knows? Anyway, my curators and archivists say that this arrangement somehow restricts its remaining power, and we should just leave it here. As he looked at his two employees, his eyes darted away. It felt as if he was checking with them on whether or not he should continue revealing what he knew. The answer must have been yes, since he went on. It was an odd, awkward moment. Even more, he said, began arriving. Very few items were now related directly to local history. The brother belonged to the curio or weirdly obscure branch of his collections, and his burgeoning studies in such matters only grew and deepened. Once more he acquired a house on Pleasant Road, then another nearby up the hill with a barn he outfitted to store some of the objects and artifacts, until the new place could be fixed up. At the original site he installed a few flood precautions, including a handy number of sandbags ready for deployment. From there, the enterprise continued to blossom, and the website eventually attracted some outside investors in 1998 who were interested in promoting state, county, and local consciousness, becoming a charitable partner. Apparently this was under the direction of a family of New England origin who were often silent partners in such enterprises. Mr. Klassen did not specify any more details, but only gave one final qualification. He had never met any of them. However, this had allowed him to hire some really qualified staff with advanced degrees, experience, and knowledge of the various subjects. The third stage had continued in unbroken progress until they purchased the current site a few years ago. They'd still faced challenges several times, but had come through. There was a lot that emerged from our brief discussions, and the man was a true gentleman. Do younger people even still say that? And for his insight and perhaps wisdom, he was not completely the driving force of his own establishment. Even he acknowledged that he had been guided, encouraged, and fed information. Clearly, though, Mr. Klassen did not understand all of the significance of what he had in this place. Without having to really ask, I assumed that recommendations for who he should hire had come from those mysterious patrons. In the end, Mr. Klassen made his goodbyes quickly. There were other matters that needed his attention. As I turned to go, the brother and sister, curator and archivist, came closer. "We appreciate your visit, Mr. Zohar," the sister, Skylar, said. Her tone was lilting, sophisticated. "Having someone of your caliber in the struggle against shade and shadow is a great honor." She gave me a smile, then also moved on. I ended up standing there with Enos Lorenz, his green eyes probing me once more. "Are there any final questions that you might have for me?" he asked. My mouth twitched slightly, and I tried to work my jaw, but nothing came out in that moment. How had they learned my name and identity? Such information is highly confidential. I'm afraid I took a step backwards. I wondered just who he could represent. It was not as if I were afraid of some evil outcome. I intuitively felt these people were all on the side of light, stood in the right place, had long ago chosen the side they were on. It was rather the intense presence surging from him, a presence I could not help but recognize. This man knew far more than he could ever properly have the time to articulate. "How did you know my name?" "That's quite an accomplishment," I said. "Not only that, but we know all about your organization, root and branch, and have for some while. We have even worked with you at many points in the past, although you did not know what secret hand acted with and for you. Our connection is perhaps best seen via the history of the Sorrowing Knights." His reference to that organization, centuries old, one branch who had arrived in the British colonies to shut down the witchcraft trials, was one of the originating points of my own corporation. I really did try not to blink first in his presence, but what could I do? I managed to continue, though. "How does this place even exist? Who is really behind this? And how is it a fixed place, deeply rooted into the land itself? Is it really a repository?" He tilted his head. All very interesting questions, Mr. Zohar, but all perhaps for another time. Enos turned and peered around behind him. Someone else was coming. He spoke the next words distinctly, and with a certain urgency. While we do appreciate your keen interest, a lot of preparation is ahead of us, and we are now preoccupied with many weighty matters. When these difficult times have passed, we will reach out for you. He had begun striding forward but paused. There is one question I do not only care to answer now, but will gladly do so. He closed the short distance between us, went to my right side, leaned in toward me, and whispered a single word into my ear. I swayed a little. Could all those rumors be really true? I nodded stiffly before Enos Lawrence took his leave and disappeared around the corner. Approached by the same young woman who'd taken my ticket on all 3 visits, I was escorted toward the foyer. I did ask the young lady one question I had forgotten to ask Enos or Rayner. It turned out her name was Elizabeth Stratton, and she'd moved here with the specific goal of working at this museum. She told me she'd worked in the local pizza shop I'd eaten in when she'd first arrived, but finally gotten an interview with Rayner. It turned out against her initial fears that his exorbitant and gracious friendliness wasn't a prelude to some nonsense, but just what it seemed, and he was generally the best boss she'd ever known. She told me this not long after I asked my final question. The place had had some kind of trouble recently. Rayner had referred to recent struggles, but didn't elaborate. And the couple had stated that everyone was fortunate to still have the museum after what had nearly happened. Oh, she replied, then shrugged. I shall never forget the casualness of that shrug, as if it were all matter of fact, routine. I had seen many agents do that when recounting some strange case, when they had been working on such things for years. This perhaps unnerved me more than anything else. Some angry drug dealers and suppliers tried burning the museum down, twice, but failed the first time and failed even more spectacularly the second. One of them ended up missing completely, and the other had an accident that left him smashed up pretty badly. Security found him afterward, next to a gas can that had been, well, this might be a rumor, crushed flat. However, when this occurred, it had shattered any chance it had to ignite at all. The word being circulated around was pulverized. One officer said that nothing human could have ever done that. The now-retired drug distributor mumbled something about wheels within wheels and eyes that could break his soul, or some such nonsense. Why, I asked, would drug dealers and traders want this place destroyed? You are an alternate supplier, are you? I made sure I smiled when I said it. She answered with a light, pleasant laugh, then went on. You've been through this place. It changes people in ways they don't immediately see, in ways they don't expect. The journey through can, well, erase patterns of thought and behavior, and replace them. You are still left free in continuing down any foolish path you choose, but it opens up windows, even doors within the soul. Bring a few opiate addicts through here on accident, and all kinds of possibilities open up for them. Some of them never touched anything again. That's why I wanted to work here. My brother was pretty messed up, and my parents thought a trip away would be good for him. We ended up here. Once he'd gone through, he was quiet, almost still. In the car, he slept. When before, without his stuff, he'd had a hard time, was almost an insomniac. Hey, my brother has weird reactions to things. And he requested food right away. Once he got back home, he'd changed. In fact, he's a little overweight now. She chuckled, but her eyes were moist. Anyway, a lot of locals come through here now. And well, the trade in illegal substances has been declining catastrophically. Apparently, they got a hold of some former customers and got the truth. Even giving them the stuff didn't work the same anymore. I guess they got desperate, but it didn't work. This place is protected in ways I can't fathom, and even Mr. Classen doesn't get. You know, my brother said something afterward that stuck with me. We both worked for big companies, and they were never pleasant. He once told me his definition of a big corporation. She paused. I waited a moment. Which was? I asked. Corporations are machines for crushing and eating people. It's what they do. But this museum was a place. There was a living, organic experience that untwisted people from whatever had left them all distorted and tangled up inside. That by going through its halls, it somehow began the process of straightening out what had been all chaos inside, and made a start reorganizing all of it. This last part was even more revelatory than the one word Enos had spoken to me. Tim Zohar sat back, his eyes haunted. What was the word, I asked. I don't know if you'd be familiar with it, but it implied volumes. I studied him, waiting. He finally leaned forward again and nearly whispered it himself. Ah, Notzerim, he said. That was the word. The word is Old Hebrew, probably originating in the 1st century of the Common Era. It could be translated in various ways. It might be from the root netzer, a branch. It may also possibly refer to someone from the village of Nazareth. More likely in this context, it is most simply translated as watchmen, or as those who stand guard, as keepers, as preservers. No single English word can do the concept justice. We'd heard rumors, of course, found a small trace here and there, but nothing which confirmed the existence of such an establishment, beyond hints of a so-called mysterium. Last time I checked, Rayner's son Connor had taken over as director, coming back after serving as a naval officer aboard the Kearsarge-class carrier James Madison. When I visited a few years back, the place was even larger. This time, I didn't ask any awkward questions, but just let the atmosphere quietly wash over me and enjoy the immersive experience. Yet one more thing troubled me, the reference to a Sharpen's cave, and I knew this merited further investigation by myself or others. Perhaps you'll learn that story at some point as well. He grew quiet, fidgeted with a button on his shirt nervously, then continued on. There are still pieces of this I can't comment on, but a meeting did take place between us. Some aspects of the larger picture were clarified, and a kind of treaty of shared and exclusive responsibilities was agreed upon. I can't say any more than that, except this other group was very ancient and very powerful. I was left a bit stunned by all this. I have to ask, how far back does this all go? This fight, our research? How long has someone been standing in the gap by holding up a sword of light against the attentive terrors of the night? I've learned many things over the years, but I do not understand everything, and many pieces of the puzzle are still outside my reach. I had always considered myself pretty astute with the history of the phenomenon, but this hinted at a far larger landscape than even I had guessed. I had imagined I knew my stuff. I had even spent a few years studying with the Israeli mystic Ayaha of Safed, and he had taught me much. One of his abiding principles was that we live in a sea of mystery. This does not mean we cannot know in part, but that there will always be things out there beyond our ability to fully understand, and that it is possible to live in that wisdom. This was a vital lesson against whatever pride had wrapped itself around my heart, where fortunately its poison had not yet entered. Which makes me wonder, was my visit arranged as an object lesson? If so, it is one that has benefited me for a long time. With that, Tim concluded his story. Speaking of rumors, I had almost asked him further about this enigmatic teacher or master of his, Ayaha of Safed, but instead waited for a more opportune moment. We chatted a few more minutes. This time I was the first one who left, leaving Tim sitting there quietly. As I walked outside into the breezy fall night, I felt the absence of a jacket. I did not expect it to get so cold. I watched distant traffic going down Rothbrook Road. For the first time after hearing one of Tim's stories, I felt hopeful. Not all of the anomalous phenomena were dark and full of terror. There were people who had taken on the task of restraining some of them with a kind of creative power few had ever imagined. The one group, represented by Tim's people, did not know about the other, but this hidden coterie he'd encountered had been vigilant nonetheless, staying away from, it appeared, the main pathways of politics, dominance, and advantage. For the first time I wondered if I would ever encounter any of these things directly on my own. Perhaps in some way that was the purpose of these tales, and why I was being prepared. For some reason the idea no longer frightened me. As I made my way home, I felt a sudden rush from all of the new and curious potentialities before me. For so long I had wondered just where Tim's stories would lead me in the end. I was afraid, even while fascinated, that they would only be in dark places. But now a bit of sunlight had been let into that dim room. I am often guilty of an almost eternal pessimism when it involves human beings and their interactions with the world, and for a few weeks his stories catered to that aspect of my personality. As I sat in my small office with the transcription of a story, trying to understand the depth of it all, although I will weigh what evidence I can and put it all together with the others. For now, as I finish this, I can feel some assurance that the world is not a complete well of darkness. This time, he took me to a different place, one not so personal, but far deeper. For who can now guess what he will unveil when he and I meet again? So, dear friends, yet another piece of this strange puzzle has been revealed, and more clues abound. Should it really surprise you that it was not of the venomous darkness, but of hope and light? Did you not suspect that some of the unraveling of the cloth might be of a different nature? Perhaps it is only a bit of lightsome music in the midst of a sad and dark symphony, or maybe, just maybe, there is far more in this than you suspected at first. So many more hidden patterns are left that you could never count all of them. Yet I will continue here alongside you on this journey, a voice in the dark, a companion in this night. Didn't I promise? For we have only just begun unveiling the hidden qualities and brighter threads within the fabric. If you pull a string, but you've already been warned, haven't you? Even so, faithful listeners, let us hope that you will stay on and see this to its last destination. This has been a Story Preeminent Fiction podcast, presented by Broken Circle, Pull a String. Created, conducted, and narrated by Stephen L. Dailey. Photographed by Stephanie Dailey. Music courtesy of Scott Buckley. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you for listening. Next episode, The Influencers.